Live from the sun-drenched cobblestones of the Eternal City, conversation crossing faith, culture, and current events. Civil discourse, civil debate, and the free exchange of ideas. This is Intersections with Bree Dail and Matt Dooley. Now your hosts, Bree and Matt.
And good morning. Welcome to an all-new Intersections Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events with Bree Dail and Colonel Matt Dooley. For those of you who are joining for the first time, I am an international accredited journalist, including accreditation to the Holy See as the Rome correspondent for the Epoch Times. You may also find me on Catholic News Report, and I've contributed to National Catholic Register and other outlets. I do hold a BA in History from Christendom College and a master's degree in Foreign Policy and Diplomacy from the prestigious Norwich University, that which I think will be utilized today as we discuss diplomacy and some of the things we're seeing out of Ukraine and Russia. But first, Matt, if you can reintroduce yourself to those who are joining us for the first time.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Matt Dooley. I served 21 and a half years in the U.S. Army as an armored cavalry officer. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from the United States Military Academy at West Point with a major in military history and a minor in systems engineering. So I have both ends of the humanities and science and math doctrine. I also have a Master of Military Art and Science for Commanding General Staff College. The U.S. Army has that out at Fort Leavenworth. We'd like to say you're either there for the long stay or the short stay. The short stay is you went to the Commanding General Staff College. I went to the Commanding General Staff College. And like you say, I think we'll be touching on some of our expertise today. A lot of interesting topics.
You know, Matt, before we begin, I usually try to start the show off into the three sections we usually do, which is news out of Rome and out of the Vatican, and then break that down, and we go then into news in current events and, what we're seeing in culture. And certainly we're going to be hitting a lot of current events and culture today. I want to kind of overview what some of the news out of the Vatican over the last few weeks since we haven't been on. For those of you who are joining us, sorry for that. We've had a lot of, it seems like Mondays have been the big, holidays for those of us who work in the federal government. But so we weren't on last week, but, a lot has taken place, and we're going to try to catch up today and kind of give you perspectives. Now, Matt and I have had some interesting discussions, both online and offline, on our assessments on Russia and Ukraine. And I think we continue to observe with skepticism on multiple fronts on what's coming out of the news, out of Ukraine. And I think it's really important to begin when I'm discussing the Vatican, just to reemphasize that as a journalist, it is the ethics of a journal. The real ethics of journalism is to provide facts and qualified assessments when requested, but to inform you and not form your opinions for you. And during this time, very heightened last few years, we've seen a lot of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda type things coming out of, whether it comes from the governments that are in play with the recent pandemic, or even out of the Vatican. And I have always said, never trust, always verify when it comes to journalism. Don't trust me because I say so. Ask me for resources and sourcing, because that's where, just kind of basic ethics, as well as what we kind of are taught in school. Source your opinions, back yourself up with experts. And sadly, we saw, it was unfortunate that he had to do this, but the Hungarian ambassador to the Holy See, Eduard Habsburg, very well respected, very intelligent, and very, I would say, as the Italians say, piano, very slowly discerning. He's been in the game for a very long time, and he's a Habsburg. So when we say a long time, he comes from a background that's very intricate into history. He has come out now twice, I think, maybe even 3 times on social media, saying, please slow down and double check your sourcing before you put things out that could potentially impact people receiving information on what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. And so when I talk about what we're seeing in the Vatican right now, reports are coming out that, you know, the synod on synodality, for example, that's been going on for the last few years is really out there specifically to push new agendas for, you know, ordaining married men. That has been pushed before by certain individuals, pushing that again. No actual foundation or factual evidence to say that. There's a discussion on that, but same with the situation with the Synod on the family, as well as the Amazon Synod, both of which had those discussions, both of which discussions ended with it being shot down by Pope Francis. And yet we saw the same, I call them the usual suspects, sadly, both on the right and the left extremes, pushing agendas instead of news. So understand that this past week in the Vatican, the German bishops came to give ongoing reports to Pope Francis on their own synod. And the Germans have really gone off the deep end, one must say, in accordance with what the church has been teaching for 2,000 years on marriage and the family. That's something that is known. That's not something that is, you know, basic, you know, on my opinions. They have pushed far leftist agenda to the Vatican, which has consistently been shot down by Pope Francis. And there has been a lot of tension between the German hierarchy and Pope Francis for quite some time. So, you know, reports of, you know, not substantiated, just based off of rumor that there are things going on, just know that they were here, and that there is a pattern of this type of behavior that is often shut down by Pope Francis. So that's one thing. Secondarily, what we saw over the week is that Pope Francis is beginning to make some moves diplomatically, and we're keeping a real eye, those of us who understand the history behind popes being involved with Russia from the time of John Paul II and his involvement, very unique involvement with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, bringing down the USSR. There's a book called the President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister. I think that's the name of the book. That's very solid and talks about the Vatican's involvement with that. Vatican's intelligence community is extremely solid, and it's because they are in all countries and they have ears to the ground on everything. It's important to understand the ideology and why the Vatican has been seen as essential to infiltrate because of that. But long and short, Pope Francis has been told by his doctors he is not permitted right now to be doing a lot in public because of his knee. He has a really, and we've seen this in video, he has really bad knee, and he almost throws it. He almost like drags it along when he walks, and it's just had a lot of inflammation. And so his doctors have told him he is not allowed to really do anything, and he's not going to be officiating over Ash Wednesday this week because of that. But even after that was put out by the Vatican's press office, Pope Francis went to the embassy, the Russian embassy, to the Holy See, which is located right next door to me on Via della Conciliazione, and he stayed there for a half an hour unannounced. He just went and he spoke with the ambassador there, and then the next day he spoke with the Prime Minister of Ukraine. So understand that we are starting to see some politique that is taking place in the Vatican. And a lot of people say, well, it doesn't mean anything, you know, he's just grandstanding and whatnot. I would say that his ongoing call for prayer for Ukraine is really placing him in a position of trying to advocate for peace. He's also been asked and approached by the Russians and the Russian hierarchy in the Orthodox Church to meet with them for some time. And that was reiterated this past week, too, before all of this started to take place. So we might actually see, if he plays his cards right, which I think he will, Matt, I think we might see him formulate his legacy not on the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass, but on advocating for peace between Russia and Ukraine. Your thoughts before we head on to our second portion of the show today?
Yeah, I think his role in intervening in this is not trivial. For the first time since the end of the 20th century, we have another major uh, large scale war in Europe, and that's a big deal. And what we thought was going to be the big confrontation between NATO and the West and the godless communists of the Soviet Union didn't happen. The Cold War ended, um, but I would submit this is the last battle of that Cold War, because a lot of what shapes Vladimir Putin's views on things, I'm just talking about what's inside his calculus and what's come out recently in this very dark apocalyptic turn recently that led us to this, is this sense of a greater destiny for Russia. Now, does he want to establish Soviet communism? No, but he wants to reestablish Soviet sphere and influence around roughly aligned with the original boundaries. He sees himself in terms of victimhood, and he's invoked the use of the Orthodox Church for his own purposes. I don't believe for a second that Vladimir Putin is a Christian in his heart at all, but I do believe he's shrewd enough to think he's using it. And that brings me to my point here, that the Pope is definitely the kind of person we need involved between two Christian nations which are at each other's throats. The Ukrainians are following Christian doctrine in being entitled to self-defense. And unfortunately, their Christian Russian brothers are not. This is a very much a Cain versus Abel kind of thing. And if the Pope can speak to that, I think he can get into this cycles of some of the other more powerful Russians. Do I believe he's going to convince Putin to have an attack of conscience? No, he's a former KGB colonel. So I'll leave it at that.
You know, Matt, one of the things that we have agreed to disagree on is the motivation for Putin. Now, I know that his background is KGB. I've read his book First Person. And it's interesting because I've not been one to agree with someone like Ben Shapiro on his assessment on Russia as much as maybe many people who've listened to this has in the past. But I found something very interesting in his recent show that I listened to in his assessment on the current situation. Because, you know, I've said before, too, that I think that Putin is looking at trying to restore old Mother Russia, and that's to include the strong focus on Christianity, strong focus on Russian independence and Russian, you know, one-on-one with the West, and how that could be utilized for, you know, the Western benefit, knowing, you know, that they're always going to be adversarial because their intention is Russia first. Ben Shapiro said that Putin is looking to try to set himself as the next Peter the Great. And I found that very interesting. That is exactly my assessment of looking at how Putin has responded. But I will admit to being surprised that he was not going to do the trickle effect, take portions of Ukraine that he recognized as independent and republics, Russian republics, and instead go on a full-out assault on Kiev. Your thoughts before we go to break?
Yeah, I think that your views on things were warranted for years, that he seemed to be very deliberate and a very strategic chess player. But I think the best expression I've heard and I agreed with is that we've now moved from chess to poker. He's accelerated his rhetoric. His inner circle became a bit disturbed recently by his change in tone. Russia began to look more inward over the last 3 years, and since COVID over the last 2 years, his views have turned much darker. And so I believe he's accelerated. And perhaps it's because he's 70 years old and he's looking for a legacy. Either way, he's gone all in on this one.
Well, we'll be back.
He's committed.
We'll be back, Matt, talking more about the foundation of the U.S.'s involvement. But this is Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events.
The 18th century skeptic philosopher David Hume argued the wise man should never believe in miracles because the evidence for what occurs over and over, the regular, always outweighs evidence for what does not, the rare. But is Hume right? Well, no, and here are some reasons why. First, it's not true evidence for uniform experience always outweighs evidence for what is rare. For example, have you experienced any Big Bangs lately? My guess is no. Does that mean we should reject the Big Bang? Of course not. Second, Hume's principle nullifies science itself. How could scientists ever reasonably use new findings to update their understanding of the universe if it's unreasonable to accept what contradicts our uniform experience? The answer is they couldn't. So are miracles in and of themselves off limits for the wise, as Hume puts it? Absolutely not. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
We all know children have a natural innocence and a sense of wonder. Yet our world is full of distractions that can pull families in the wrong direction. But with the help of God and a church family, your children can grow in the security of faith, hope, and love. Weekly Mass provides that critical faith foundation needed in life. So if your family hasn't been to Mass in a while, we'd like to invite you home. Discover more at catholicscomehome.org.
And welcome back to another Intersections Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events. For those of you who are watching online right now, you might actually acknowledge the fact that today I came dressed and prepared. I don't know about Matt and where his Russian style hat is, but I decided to wear my Russian style hat or Ukrainian style hat because really it's the same really area and a lot of the same culture that we are seeing in both Russia and Ukraine. Matt, you know, before we hit to break, we were talking about the motivation of Putin and, you know, Pope Francis's opportunity potentially to set a new legacy for himself as being, you know, a mitigator between two Christian states. But what we are seeing in the last few days with regards to the Russian morale on the ground and some of the things that we've been assessing on the military strikes and the responses from the Ukrainians really just fascinate me. But before we even get into, you know, Russia escalating, you know, nuclear threat, etc., I think it's really important for us to step back for a second and talk about why we are finding ourselves, or Ukraine is finding itself in a situation where it's asking for support from the Western community and not receiving any and being very disappointed on that. Is there like some kind of foundational document that was signed in 1994 that causes Ukraine now to double think ever potentially involving itself with Western authorities, and maybe the cause behind Ukraine pushing for, you know, engagement with Russia, saying that it will never join NATO, period, point blank? Thoughts?
Yeah, Bree, what you were referring to is something we've talked about in previous shows, and then this is the memorandum that was signed during the Clinton era as the Soviet Union broke up. And this was, you know, very fresh in 1994. Each of these independent republics, of which Ukraine was now one, had to figure out where they were going to go in the new construct. So this Commonwealth of Independent States is what replaced the Soviet Union. So each of them would work and collaborate together, but everyone was concerned with a substantial portion of the old Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine. So how do you account for that? The last thing you want is someone getting a hold of one of those missiles or any of those deposits of refined uranium that goes into a multiple reentry vehicle and using it for terrorism purposes. The old phrase, I don't care about the guy who wants 5,000 nuclear weapons. I only care about the guy who only wants one. That was the concern. We've got to wrap these things up and account for them because the Ukrainian government, which did not have much other than agriculture as its source of income, might have been tempted to sell these things and was looking for some other way ahead. And so reassuring them that they could give up these weapons, transfer them to custody of the Russians, was in everyone's interest for the long term. And so we signed a memorandum, we being the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, saying, you'll hand these things over, and in trade for that, we'll respect your boundaries. Everyone will respect your borders, language, and culture, and separate identity as an independent nation. Your security is solid. So now here we are, flash forward some 20 years later, and we've got the Russian army inside Ukraine at the behest of the madman. And the Ukrainians are asking, hey, where is everybody here? You said you were going to guarantee our security. And it's only recently that we've collectively as the West figured out that we probably ought to do some things to shore up their defense.
You know, Matt, it's funny because I've not heard the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed by Bill Clinton in 1994. I've not heard Bill Clinton speak out at all. I saw that Hillary Clinton sent prayers and thoughts, with regards to this. Yeah. But I also recall, and I posted on social media, her video of the Russian reset button that she did as Secretary of State with the Russians. And she even screwed that up, where the word for reset was messed up by the United States, and instead it was for overcharge. I think that was the word that they used instead on that reset button. But other than thoughts and prayers, I've not heard from President Clinton. Perhaps I'm wrong, but he was the one to sign the memorandum, and I was told by Congressman Massey about a month or so ago, when all of this started to take place, he said that signature, that memorandum, is not constitutional. So by law, we are not, and by treaty, we are not obligated to support the Ukrainians in any fashion. But Matt, there has been reportedly some leaked documents on conversation between the Chinese and the Russians, on the Chinese saying, we are watching you, we are not. So the reports this past week, Matt, is that Biden shared intelligence with the Chinese, asking for the Chinese to stand with the United States and the West in convincing Russia not to do these things. China turned around and shared that information directly with Russia. I mean, our president shared intelligence with an adversary, and the adversary shared it with the Russians, who are not quite adversaries and not quite, they're definitely not allies. But now that's put them into the camp of adversary against the West, even more so by that shared intelligence. And the Chinese, in fact, have said to the Russians, we're watching how the West is going to respond on this because we're looking at Taiwan. Yeah. And so what causes the Taiwanese to not start doing an arms race for nuclear weapons because they know the West is not going to come? Are we going to see an arms race? Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a cascade of consequence here. Again, I'm not, as I did not endorse Vladimir Putin's logic and reasoning for why he gave his concerns for his own security, but I could still explain it. I'm not endorsing our foreign policy and sharing intel with the Chinese, but I can explain it. The idea was to reveal to Vladimir Putin's closest friend, as he was entering into a closer relationship with China, that we knew everything he was doing, in the belief, however naive, that it would cause him to give a moment of pause and say, you know what, they know what I'm going to do anyway. They don't believe anything I'm saying, so maybe I ought to stand down. In retrospect, it's always easier to view in hindsight. That certainly didn't work. And we probably should have considered the fact that Chinese were just going to turn in their swivel chair and hand it straight to the Russians. Right. But you can see that it didn't work and it was silly. But I do think the Chinese also thought that Putin was probably playing a bit of poker and was bluffing. I don't think they thought he was going to go all in. If they thought he was going to intervene militarily at all, it would have been for, as you assessed, going after the Donbass region and maybe consolidate his gains. Right. But not a four-way, three-corps assault on the capital and everything, with the ultimate end game for phase 3 or phase 4 being on the western border of Ukraine with all the entire territory underneath the boot of his army. I don't think the Chinese believe that. And so there has been some recent efforts to distance themselves. That being said, I do believe they're looking at the West's reaction. And I do believe that they have to have a moment of pause. That, okay, if the West is willing to do this for Ukraine, they're probably also willing to condemn us over Taiwan. So maybe we ought to continue a slower march to a more peaceful solution. But everyone else has a vote. And I do believe Taiwan is going to consider themselves whether or not they need to be independent and in charge of their own defense. And they're going to make some decisions here that we're not going to have a vote on. And I believe the Ukrainians, when this is over and if they're still standing, are going to have a cascade of consequential decisions they're going to make, as well as the rest of the Eastern member nations of NATO. I can tell you Poland and the Baltic republics are never going to look at this the same way twice. No. And in the end game, we can talk about this in our next segment, but the end game of, what does it end up looking like for Putin? Does he survive this? I have of the firm belief that this is it for him.
Yeah, I concur. Matt, one of the things that I find really interesting is also the response of Western Europe and the United States. So Jen Psaki went around on the MSM in the last 24 hours and saying, this should just be another example of why the United States needs energy independence. And then she continued on to talk about green energy, right? But energy independence, like I do recall back in 2019, 2020, where exports of crude oil, it was higher for the first time in U.S. history than imports of crude oil. And that was labeled by Forbes and others as we are now, the United States is now energy independent. But there was so much more that could be done. That sadly, because of environmentalist pressure, has really limited U.S. in energy independence, and also U.S. exports to other countries that are still very much reliant to energy out of Russia. That being, the pipeline, that being fracking, that being, going out into the shale oils, out in the United States. We are also seeing in Europe heavily dependent on energy while they are claiming that they are abiding by the Paris Climate Agreement. So on one side, they're saying, well, we're not going to produce any energy. We're not going to continue to look for oil and whatnot, but and natural gas. We're not going to do that in our country. We're just going to use Russia to do that. And so what has happened because of the pipeline out of Russia, a pipeline that, by the way, had been, for those of you who don't know, a pipeline that had been pushed very hard during the Cold War, and which Reagan fought that very hard. It's where we get the term Reaganomics from, specifically when it comes to international policy, was that Reagan came down very hard on Western companies that were producing equipment to help the Russians build this pipeline. So this is an ongoing, very long-term project that the Russians have now accomplished, this Nord Stream pipeline that provides natural gas to Europe, and which now Europe is dependent upon Russia. So Russia now can technically saber rattle because they know that it's going to be very painful for the Europeans to shut down dependence on their energy production. Matt, if they don't shut down, especially the Germans were very much hesitant in agreement with putting sanctions on this Nord Stream pipeline. They're also very, very hesitant in the Western European countries to put sanctions on the SWIFT bank accounts. These are two areas that would actually cause pain to a waning economy like Russia has. Russia's GDP right now can be equated to, say, the GDP of Florida. So it's waning, and the rubles, the Russian currency, just tanked over the weekend. So Matt, yes, like economic sanctions, they work. But if it's not going to work for the long term, if Europe's not willing to step up and engage in independence from Russia, are we going to see the long game as Putin has, he's pretty much dictator for life. So as Putin has relied upon the long game, is he going to be able to sustain his economy during this war if the Europeans kind of renege on any financial any type of financial consequences to Russians invading Ukraine? And do you think that the U.S. needs to rethink its energy policies?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the reason why Europe is intertwined with Russian natural gas and the connections to international banking is that we had the belief that after the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that a one unified Europe was the vision, and that's a noble goal. I don't want to cast any dispersions against that, but in the end, we're looking at the death of idealism. Um, that we reached out, and in the very early days, we even recommended that Russia join NATO. But for reasons that only Vladimir Putin can clearly tell you, that didn't happen. And so here we have this dependence on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and this dependence on, from a European perspective, on Russian petroleum products. And that does give a guy like Vladimir Putin a outsized influence over the determination of where the center of gravity of EU politics, and in particular German politics, happens to lie. And that was all true right up until last Wednesday, when Putin decided he was going to go all in. Now things are different. And it took a while for everyone to come around. But everyone recognizes that whatever comes out of this, there can never be a permissive environment for Russian dominance over how Western Europe determines what it does and where it goes and how it relates to everyone else. That's over. They're in the realpolitik now. And so you're starting to see several nations, including non-NATO nations, pushing weapons and resources and money towards the Ukrainians because they recognize the fight for freedom is right there. Regardless of whether or not Ukraine is in NATO, that's irrelevant now. Ukraine longs to be free, regardless of any level of corruption. That's irrelevant now because they're trying to become more westernized, trying to become more accountable, trying to pull away from the Putin model, from the oligarch model. And so that's the frontier of where this idealism meets the cynicism of a guy like Vladimir Putin. Everyone's figured that out. So the complexities of Nord Stream 2 are in our rearview mirror. Will that ever be turned on again? That's up to the oligarchs, but they're going to have to get rid of old Vlad. Does Ukraine ultimately join NATO? Maybe, maybe not. But I'll tell you one thing: is there another other countries who were thinking about it, who are definitely going to come in now? The Finns, the Swedes, everyone who wondered whether or not they should be a part of the protection plan is going to sign up because Vladimir Putin demonstrated to them why.
And the
That
UN
NATO
did too. The UN demonstrated its ineptitude when the United States went to discuss this, and the Russians and the Chinese shot down, and the Indians, interesting enough, shot down the idea of sanctions through the UN. So UN, I feel like, I don't know about future engagement internationally wise, but I think most of the Western world is now seeing the ineptitude of the UN and what really the UN is meant for, which is for peacekeeping operations and trying to de-escalate situations.
The UN is for peacekeeping, and NATO is a defensive alliance. If you look at what NATO has done since the end of the Cold War, every one of its moves including going to Afghanistan, was in reaction to a defensive action. That Article 5 was invoked, and that's why they went to Afghanistan. NATO reached out and ended the war in Bosnia because of the ethnic genocide, and then went into Kosovo, whether you agree with it or not, to stop the same thing from happening. The only time that NATO has done anything that might threaten Russia is in just admitting those old nations that don't want to be a part of the Russian sphere anymore, precisely because of the things that Vladimir Putin is doing now.
Right.
He's proven the reason for NATO's existence, and he's solidified the decisions that these other countries that have made since 1997 to come into NATO, the logic behind it. They all understand why.
And the necessity
if you're
to
Pole,
pay
if you're a Latvian,
to pay their own dues as well, because the U.S. has been really carrying the financial water for NATO for quite some time, and you know what I find interesting, whether you appreciate it or not, that the fact that the individual that we have at the helm right now has been seen by the larger community as weak. It has placed other countries in the position of either stepping into the gap or allowing things to fail. And what we've seen has been Hungary and Poland and Eastern type countries, Poland in particular, opening up their borders. Now, Poland has been very, very, very tight on their borders, allowing so-called refugees during the Arab Spring to enter into their country. They actually have not permitted that. And yet now they have opened up their borders to Ukrainian refugees during this time. So I find all of this very interesting as we see, you know, Germany, France, Poland, and Ukraine engaging in where we're not really seeing that happening, being led by the United States. And perhaps that's necessary, recognizing that most of this is going to almost immediately impact the European community outside of the U.S. Now, speaking of impact, though, Matt, you know, we have been seeing reports that Putin and his generals are now putting their nuclear weapons capabilities on standby. You know, I would like your assessment on that because, you know, in our last segment, we're going to talk a little bit about what we have seen in actuation on the ground, reports from the ground on, you know, the first wave conflicts with the Russians and the Ukrainians. And some of the disinformation that's been coming out from both sides, and that which sadly a lot of the mainstream media has bought into. But first, I mean, this is a concern for pretty much all of humanity when we start to see, you know, talks of nuclear capabilities being, you know, enhanced and then put on standby. Matt, what are your thoughts on that? Is it saber rattling or rattling rather, or is this reality?
There are two elements to it. If Vladimir Putin remains a rational actor, and that's arguable one way or the other. So option one, he's a rational actor. This is an attempt to tell NATO and the West and the United States, you know, this far and no farther, that stay out of this. You know, I told you it was my fight. This is between us and the Ukrainians. If you're tempted to get involved, here's what I have. I'm reminding you, I'm a nuclear power. And then the response from the West was, you know, the French said, well, yeah, NATO's a nuclear power too, remember? I think he knows that. I think he knows that there are nuclear weapons all over most Western nations. There are 5,000, you know, nuclear warheads that the U.S. has. So he didn't need to be reminded, but there it is. Option two is that he really has lost his mind and that he's pushed all of his chips in here and he's going to get everything he wants, or he's willing to burn it all down in some sort of Gotterdammerung. And if he's transitioned into a Hitler bunker mentality, we've got some problems, and we're going to have to use the oligarchs to disentangle this. We're going to have to talk to other Russians to get the old man and his hands off the levers of power before he does something stupid.
Right, and I think that what's interesting is that sources that I have are saying that that's already occurring. And I would not be surprised. Remember, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friends. And when it comes to the oligarchs in Russia, they have been enduring a dictator for quite some time now. It's not saying that they are any better. But it is saying that power and control over this country is exactly what the oligarchs want. So Putin has been very careful to isolate himself from influence in this way. But I do think it is interesting that you're bringing that up, because I do think from the reports that we're getting on the ground, and when we go to break, we'll continue this, but it does seem like we are seeing from the reports on the ground that Russian soldiers, are demoralized on many areas. And who can blame them? They were scrambled for the last few months during some of the coldest and most harsh parts of the year in Russia to man a border. They are paid very little. Their economy is in shambles, and it has been for some time. And now they're being called to fight a conflict that they don't particularly believe in. There is no like Russian dominance. I mean, there's a lot of big talk out of Putin on how they're there to help provide peace in Ukraine, and very clearly,
I'm not saying it.
Yeah, very clear that there are people fighting on both sides, and very clear that there are bad actors within both sides. But this is an invasion into a sovereign country, whether he wants to recognize independence or not. But Matt, as we go to break, I hope that people who are listening today are finding this interesting. Please comment, ask your questions. We'll try to answer them on air. But we're going to be talking about what we're hearing on the ground, what we're assessing, and then some of the things that we've seen on social media that has been disinformation. And Matt and I will hopefully be able to provide you some insight on what to expect next, based off of our backgrounds in the military. But as we go to break, we are going to call and repeat what Pope Francis has asked for, which is, let's pray and let's fast for peace in Ukraine, starting on Ash Wednesday of this week. Really praying for peace amongst those two Christian nations that we're watching. But for now, we will be heading on to break, and when we return, we'll be talking more about assessment from military action on the ground. It might surprise you what we say on what we're seeing from the ground. But this is Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events. We'll be back after break.
Critics often accuse Christians of being intolerant for saying a person's belief is wrong, the underlying assumption being that a tolerant worldview accepts everyone's opinions as having equal value. What can we say in response? Well, first, the objection wrongly assumes that tolerance means accepting everyone's opinions as having equal value. The true meaning of tolerance is respecting a person's dignity even though you think he's wrong. We're labeled as intolerant for saying someone is wrong, but yet saying someone is wrong belongs to the essence of tolerance. Second, the charge applies a double standard. The objector says the Christian is being intolerant for saying someone's belief is wrong, but yet in doing so, the objector necessarily implies the Christian's belief is wrong, and thus is being intolerant according to his own standards. So the charge from intolerant is simply confused and inconsistent. I'm Carlo Broussard with the ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Years ago, when I started acting, modeling, and singing in Mexico, my Catholic faith was not the center of my life. It took me many years to discover that success, fame, money, and all the pleasures of the world were not going to fulfill me. I got to a point in my life where I thought I had everything, but I realized something was missing. Thankfully, I began a faith journey that brought me back to God and home to the Catholic Church. You can too.
Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.com.
And welcome back to our last segment for Intersections Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events. I am Bree Dail. I'm joined by Colonel Matt Dooley. And during this last segment, I'm going to really have Matt assess, since Matt's background is to that, I want to share one of the areas of disinformation that we just have to be careful about before we report. So over the week, we heard the story of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, on an island called Snake Island, who were reportedly radioed by the Navy, the Russian Navy, and were told to like give up their arms and whatnot. And their response was, "Go F yourself." That's what the Ukrainians said. And supposedly after that, all of these Ukrainian soldiers were killed by the Russian Navy. This was what was put out on social media. Well, within the first few hours, the reports were like, well, we're not quite sure whether or not they didn't survive. Well, we're not quite sure whether or not they were killed. I will report that Politico this morning has now said the Ukrainian soldiers on Snake Island are alive, Navy says. So please be aware, including with the propaganda out of Ukraine talking about this ghost, the ghost of Kiev who is shooting down all of these Russian aircraft. There's potential there for propaganda and disinformation, and that's what propaganda does oftentimes, is in order to inspire the troops. They'll put out propaganda in this way in order to get people to really have someone who they can center over. Another example, it's not disinformation, but is the propaganda that was put out by the Ukrainian. It's completely true on the Ukrainian president saying, being offered by the U.S. A ticket out with his family, since he is enemy number one for the Russians. If the Russians get their way, they will take him down and they will take his family, and it's likely that he will be imprisoned, if not worse. They need to cut the head off of the Ukrainian state in order to have their own puppet. This is just the normalcy of the action of taking over another country. And so he knows this, but instead of taking the offer from the United States to abandon his people, he armed up and he said, I don't need a ride, I need bullets, I need ammunition. So that again was a very good use of media and propaganda. But Matt, like what we've been seeing on the ground has been some really interesting and actual historical, and I feel like when I read some of these things, I think about what happened during World War II with Hitler towards Russia, what happened, with Napoleon trying to extend into Russia. The biggest and most difficult thing, especially during this time, this season, which is very cold and unforgiving, is running out of how you get your troops fed, armed, and how you get your transport fueled and maintained. Matt, what are you seeing on the ground, and what are some of your assessments on this last segment?
Well, first and foremost, you're absolutely right. When we talk about the information flowing out of there, there's an effort in the information space. We talk about multi-domain operations. The first layer, before you even get to discussing about what's happening on the ground or in the air immediately over the battlefield or on the sea, the first layer is information operations out there in carrying the narrative and counter narrative in politics. And that's what you see a lot of what's happening. And this is really one of the world's first, what I would call TikTok and internet wars. I mean,
Yes.
We've had this social media before, but there is an expertise to a degree and sort of a hacker chic that's going on and managing information. And so, yeah, having a critical thinker's eye when you're looking at things and seeing videos, there's certainly no harm in that. Take everything with a grain of salt. So that being said, what is conclusive is that the Ukrainian military has stood its ground very well. And so whether the message on Snake Island was something that resulted in the demise of those Ukrainian defenders or not, the message about standing defiantly to the Russians is clear. And whether or not the ghost of Kyiv has 6 kills or more than that, or if he did it all himself or he had some help, that's happened. So what's happening, and when you look at what Vladimir Putin has done, is most of your senior military pundits out there are talking about this concept called overreach. coordinating the movements of four separate lines of effort, four assault prongs across a country, is not a trivial effort. And so when you think about massing 150,000, 160, 190,000 troops, and the kinds of teeth to tail ratio, meaning combat versus logistics support, that has to be carefully planned. And the old Soviet army was not built with a lot of logistics behind it. Their plan was to come at us in waves. First wave would then expend itself and culminate, and the second wave would hit, expend itself and culminate, then a third wave. And so our counter to that was airline battle, to be able to penetrate and hit successive waves while we were engaged with the first wave in front of us. But what was never a part of that was the Soviet plan for resupply. That's why you see Soviet and now Russian tank designs with those 55-gallon barrels on the backs of those tanks. They were supposed to self resupply, and your extension, if you're a Russian tanker, is based off the fuel you bring with you, because they just don't have that many fueler trucks, and the ones they do are very, very vulnerable. So when we talk about what you're seeing here, particularly in the north, when you have Kiev and Kharkov, those two towns are important. They're right up against the Belarusian border, but they're also right up against the Pripyat marshes. Those marshes, if they're frozen, are great. You can move your stuff across. If they're not frozen, you have problems. And we could talk about global warming and climate change, but they're not frozen.
They're not frozen.
There's a lot of vehicles mired, and so if you want to stay out of the marshes, you're road bound, which means you are now predictable, and they can stack you up in a column and slow you down and run you out of gas. We're now into we're into day 5, day 6 of this, depending on where you are in the world, and they're running out of gas. That first wave ran out of fuel around the early morning hours of Saturday. And what happens is then you become a pillbox. And a tank without fuel can't run its batteries. Batteries can't power its thermal sites. And when there are manual backup systems, you can't see at night. And so a lot of vehicles are getting abandoned. So that first wave is culminated. Putin has now gone all in and sent the second wave. He's got 60% of his combat power committed inside the borders. And so you're starting to see that fierce fight around Kharkiv again, and a fierce fight to try to take Kyiv again. But if the Ukrainians can stand, they stand a significant chance of dragging this out 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, Putin's got to make some serious decisions, or the oligarchs have to make some serious decisions about him.
Right, and Matt, one of the things that I have been watching closely is how the Russians have sought to obtain air dominance, and that's what you would expect from anybody to take the airports immediately.
They still don't have it.
They don't have it, and they don't have port dominance. They don't have access to that port. The Ukrainians have played well in this, and what I find very interesting is you sent to me conscript army. One of the things that I find very interesting is watching the Ukrainians arming every single citizen. Every single citizen is taking up arms. Matt, does this remind you of a certain, constitutional right that for so long has been brought down by the by certain pundits in our politics, saying that this is only for hunting, this was only for militia. Every single person in Ukraine, just like every single person in Israel, knows how to fire a weapon or is learning how to do so now. Matt,
go back and read Madison and the Federalist Papers. Madison and the Federalist Papers will tell you all about what the Second Amendment was about and what they were thinking. And it's precisely this. It wasn't about hunting. It wasn't about squirrel rifles. It was about the necessity of a well-armed population, what they called well-regulated, which didn't mean rules. It mean well-appointed. In the language of 1787 to 1789, well-regulated meaning well-equipped. That the militia, the army, is the people. And you make armies from the people. And if you're going to do that, they have to be well-equipped and well familiar with their arms. The discussion about the American Second Amendment is coming from the Ukrainians. Exactly all about this, and they'll state it. In the end, You're looking at a conscript army from the Russians, kids who were at the end of their 2-year enlistment,
Right.
trying to go up against people who are fighting for their homes.
Homes.
And those people who are
And
fighting for their
that's
homes
it.
are serious about it.
And we're seeing Russian army, seeing Russian soldiers right now who are very much demoralized, who have been spent already, giving up their arms. So I think, Matt, as we conclude today, what is your assessment? What we're going to see in the next few weeks? Again, we think that, and I concur with you. I think that what we're seeing with the politics is that this is Putin's last hurrah, and who knows what was internally that pushed him to the limit where he thinks he was going to throw on all his chips. But Matt, what are we going to see out of this?
Well, time is not on his side. The Ukrainians win, Zelensky wins if he can stay alive and if he can just keep an army in the field. The longer he can drag this out, the more costly it becomes to Putin's reputation, to his standing amongst the oligarchs, to the supplies and the supply chains and his lines of communication, which are already strained. If this goes on for 2 weeks, he's going to have to make a decision. And if this goes on for longer than a month, he's going to be defeated.
Matt, thank you today for your assessment. I think we're going to have to continue to watch this because a lot of people are just not knowing where to go to get news. And I just want to reiterate that we are going to be praying and fasting for the peace in Ukraine, for this having a peaceful resolution. That
Yes.
perhaps Putin may have a conversion of heart. Or we just have to. We just don't know what's going to happen. But for now, we are going to pray and we're going to sign off, and we'll be back next week. This is Bree Dail and Matt Dooley for Intersections. God bless you. Take care, and we'll see you next week.